Welcome everyone to our panel here at Judicial Watch. I'm Tom Fitton, the president of Judicial Watch, and we're here to discuss today the topic of the voter fraud threat to free and fair elections. Judicial Watch is a conservative, nonpartisan educational foundation dedicated to promoting transparency, accountability, integrity in government, politics, and the law. Through our educational endeavors, we advocate high standards of ethics and morality in our nation's public life, and we seek to ensure that political and judicial officials obey the law and do not abuse the powers entrusted to them by the American people. We do not endorse or oppose candidates for public office. The integrity of elections is taken for granted by many Americans, but it cannot, and we must remain vigilant. As the Supreme Court noted in 2006, confidence in the integrity of our electoral processes is essential to the functioning of our participatory democracy. Voter fraud drives honest citizens out of the democratic process and breeds distrust of our government. Voters who fear their legitimate votes will be outweighed by fraudulent ones will feel disenfranchised. Unfortunately, our history is replete with elections whose results have been called into question, for good or for bad, because of allegations of fraud and misconduct. Whether it be the Daily Machine in Chicago for JFK, or hanging chads in Florida for George W. Bush, even presidential elections of the modern age have been called into question. Some even make the credible argument that voter fraud handed a United States Senate seat to Al Franken, which helped cement the Democratic majority for the first 2 years of the Obama presidency. Judicial Watch, by the way, for the record, independently counted disputed ballots on its own in Florida and found out, indeed, that then George W. Bush, the governor, beat Vice President Al Gore. The integrity of the 2008 election was called into question by the fraudulent activities of the Project Vote ACORN operation, which was an ally and former employer of Barack Obama. Of the 1.3 million voter registrations gathered by them for the 2010 vote, at least 400,000 were thrown out. And according to Judicial Watch's ongoing investigations, ACORN and its various affiliates, and most notably, of course, Project Vote, have been implicated in at least 35 well-documented election fraud schemes in 17 states, including just this year in Nevada. And all that further confirms the endemic corruption in that pro-Obama voter registration effort. ACORN and Project Vote seem to want to overwhelm the system. Using the Freedom of Information Act, Judicial Watch obtained documents of a 2007 investigation in Missouri that showed that the FBI found that those working for Project Vote and ACORN sought to, quote, cause confusion on election day to keep polls open longer, quote, allow people who can't vote to vote, and allow people to vote multiple times. Moreover, the FBI found instances of canvassers thinking that if they used a completely fake name, it would be less like ID theft. Many Americans might be thinking that ACORN and Project Vote disappeared after these voter registration scandals and the release of undercover videos showing ACORN operatives advising undercover investigative reporters how to avoid tax, immigration, and child prostitution laws. But these groups are still up to no good. This week, Judicial Watch will release the results of a new investigation that shows ACORN Project Vote bullied Colorado officials into implementing new policies for increasing the registration of public assistance recipients during the 2008 and 2010 election seasons. This push was to make it easier for those on welfare and other public assistance to register to vote. But following the policy changes in Colorado, the percentage of invalid registration forms from Colorado public assistance agencies was 4 times the national average. As a result of the collaboration, the number of voter registrations at Colorado public assistance agencies rose from 3,340 in 2007 to almost 44,000 in 2010. However, the collaboration also led, as I said, to a large number of invalid and duplicate voter registrations. A total of 8% of rejected registration forms came from public assistance agencies in Colorado in 2009 and 2010. This This is, again, more than 4 times the national average of 1.9% for that same time period. Unfortunately, many leftists oppose efforts to stamp out voter fraud. Then Senator Obama attacked efforts by the Bush Justice Department to prosecute voter fraud, and now his Justice Department, run by the pliant Attorney General Eric Holder, has simply turned a blind eye to ACORN Project Vote historic levels of voter registration fraud. Can one imagine if the Tea Party turned in 400,000 fraudulent or false voter registrations? Well, we're lucky here to have an excellent group of experts to discuss our topic, folks who have been on the front lines and investigated these issues in ways, frankly, that haven't been done before. John Fund, on my far left, is a contributor to Fox News Channel and a senior editor of the American Spectator magazine. He's a frequent contributor to publications such as the Wall Street Journal, Reader's Digest, and National Review. He is the author of several books, including his most recent and most pertinent, for this discussion, Stealing Elections, How Voter Fraud Threatens Our Democracy. Also joining me on my immediate left is J. Christian Adams, who served in the voting section of the United States Department of Justice, where he brought a wide range of election cases to protect racial minorities, ranging from vote dilution to redistricting lawsuits. He also brought cases involving military voting protections and voter intimidation cases, including one against the New Black Panther Party, which is a case you may have all heard about. He litigated the very successful Voting Rights Act case of the United States versus Ike Brown, marking the first use of the law to protect the discriminated against white minority. Prior to his time at DOJ, he served as general counsel to the South Carolina Secretary of State and was in private practice in Virginia. He's also a contributing columnist covering elections in the Justice Department, and where he's a key reporter on this issue at pajamasmedia.com, and he's written in various publications like the Examiner and the Washington Times, and he has an upcoming book about voter fraud in the Justice Department. Do you have a title for that one yet?
Injustice.
Injustice. Great. And last but not certainly least is a citizen activist, Catherine Engelbrecht, who is president of King Street Patriots, and an organization that you should be hearing more about, True the Vote. She was born in Richmond, Texas, and she's president of a high-precision oil field machine shop started in 1994 by her and her husband, Brian. Prior to 2008, Catherine had little involvement in the political arena, like a lot of Tea Party activists. She was what could be called a life activist. Roles as a wife, a mother, a founder and board member of her church, and an officer of her children's school's PTO. A city volunteer, business owner. She had plenty to focus on, and she believed, as many Americans believe, that government was best left to politicians who could be relied upon to do their best on behalf of the American people. I suspect her views changed a bit recently, and without getting into why and who's to blame. In 2009, she started the King Street Patriots to support and defend American exceptionalism, constitutional governance, and civic duty. From King Street Patriots came the True the Vote initiative, a citizen-led effort to restore honor and integrity to our electoral system. True the Vote educates voters, researches the veracity of voter registries, trains and mobilizes volunteers to work in polling places, and advocates for comprehensive election code reform legislation. So we are pleased to be joined by this excellent panel, and if I could remind the panelists to do what I have not been doing, is speaking directly into the microphone, so those of you listening on the internet can actually hear what we're saying. So John, the way this will work, and I encourage you, ask you all to turn off your cell phones so we don't get interfered with as we proceed. Our panelists will make presentations. I'll ask a few questions to cover topics that may have been missed, and then we'll open the floor up to questions and comments from you. So I turn the microphone over to Mr. Fund, John.
Great. Thank you, Tom. And Judicial Watch has certainly done yeoman effort in the investigation on ACORN. It's so pleasing to see such a large group of people assemble on 2 o'clock on such a marvelous summer day. So thank you for being so civic-minded. But your presence here indicates just how important a lot of people think this issue is. I'm taking time off right now to completely rewrite my book on election fraud and election administration, so I sympathize with Christian and what he's just gone through. And one of the things I found is how consistently over time Americans are concerned about this issue, about the broader issue of whether or not our votes count. Because we have two civil rights in this country when it comes to voting that are paramount. One is, and we fought a great civil rights struggle over this in the 1960s, people should be free of intimidation, artificial barriers to voting. We fought a long battle to make sure that there wouldn't be literacy tests and poll taxes and other devices that would prevent people from voting, would block the proverbial voting door. And we need to remember that struggle, and we need to preserve those gains. However, there's another civil right, and it's an equally powerful and important civil right. Every American has the right not to have their vote canceled out because someone is voting who shouldn't be voting, is voting twice, is ineligible to vote, is dead, or is an illegal alien, or is voting multiple times, or a variety of devices that serve to cancel out legitimate votes. Your vote can be canceled out in two ways. You're prevented or intimidated from voting, or someone votes and cancels out your vote. And we need to preserve both civil rights. The American people are very concerned about the administration of our elections. Consistently, over the last 20 years, about 40% of Americans believe there are serious doubts as to whether or not their vote is cast accurately and really counts. Some of that is people who believe that there are artificial barriers and impediments to voting. An awful lot of that are people who believe that there is voter fraud, there's things that compromise the integrity of elections. And there are other people who just don't trust the administration of elections. And they have concern on all three counts. One of the important things that I say in my book is it's not just voter fraud that we're concerned about. It's also administrative incompetence. Walter Dean Burnham, who is the leading political scientist, the dean of American political scientists, if you will, has said that America has the sloppiest voting systems of any industrialized democracy. And part of that is our strength because we have a decentralized system. And part of that is we've been complacent. We simply haven't believed that there were as many problems as they were in our election system. And sometimes the real problem in our country is with loosey-goosey laws that are vague and subject to differing interpretations and not clearly enforced, you can't tell where the incompetence ends and where the fraud begins. You have a very vague, amorphous situation in which you can't really tell what the motive or the reason for the election screw-up is, but you can tell the election has been compromised. And as the Supreme Court reminds us in a recent unanimous ruling upholding an Arizona photo ID law, when an election result is compromised so that a significant number of people question its legitimacy, that goes to the very core of our democracy. If people do not believe the election was legitimate, where the results can be trusted, they will tend not to vote, they will tend to question the actions of their elected representatives as to whether or not they're legitimate, and they will lose faith in the system as a whole. So that all of us have a stake in ensuring the integrity and the accurate administration of elections. Now, two things have happened, and I know Christian is going to go into more detail on this, as well as Catherine. Two things have happened recently that are of great concern to me. One is that a simple, common-sense reform backed by 80% of the American people, namely the requirement that photo identification be shown at the polls, has undergone a vicious attack by people who question not just the efficacy of this measure, but the very motives of the people who are proposing it. Photo ID is supported by every demographic group in America. You can't get up to 80% approval for anything in the polls anymore, including maybe mom and even apple pie. Some people don't like apple pie, and some people are estranged from their parents. So 80% is pretty much close to unanimity. 2/3 of African Americans support it, 2/3 of Hispanics, 2/3 of liberals, 2/3 of Democrats. But For some reason, this has become the focal point of a vicious attack on anyone who would propose this election reform. President Barack Obama, when he was a senator, said, "Today the poll tax is taking on a new form, photo identification requirement for voters." Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who is his hand-picked chair of the Democratic National Committee, said, Republicans want to literally drag us all the way back to Jim Crow laws and literally and very transparently block access to the polls to voters who are more likely to vote. Former President Bill Clinton said one of the most pervasive political movements going on outside Washington today is a determined effort to keep most of you from voting next time. There has never been in my lifetime, since we got rid of the poll tax and the Jim Crow laws, a determined effort to limit the franchise that we see today. Phil Noble, president of the South Carolina New Democrats, said last month, "Instead of having hoods and Klan meetings, we've dressed it up as law, but it still has the same effect as a barrier to keeping black folks from voting." Now, I suspect most of these people know better, that we're not returning to the era of Jim Crow. I ask any of you, photo ID has become part and parcel of living in a modern society, especially since 9/11. We have to show photo ID to fly a plane. We have to have photo ID available to ride a train. We have to have photo ID to cash a check. We have to have photo ID to enter a federal building. Some office buildings, private office buildings require photo ID. For those who say photo ID discriminates against Americans without one, I'm sure there are few people who don't have a photo ID, and I say we are doing them a favor, to quote Andrew Young, the former mayor of Atlanta and a colleague of Martin Luther King's. We're doing people a favor by getting them a photo ID, a free photo ID. You cannot be part of the mainstream of American life today without a photo ID. Therefore, let's get photo ID in the hands of everyone, not just as a means to identify people when they're voting, but to make sure that they're part of our larger society. At the same time that we have this assault on photo ID, we have the Obama administration Justice Department engaging in a series of very questionable moves, which Christian will go into in more detail, which seems to indicate that they want to tilt the playing field in one direction, and that's against a direction of more scrutiny on the integrity of elections, whether it is to suggest that people should be required to prove they're a citizen when they vote, to show photo ID, a whole range of areas where there had been previously a broad consensus that election reform was needed. They have challenged that and made very questionable rulings. So all of this brings us to the 2012 election. You may have noticed that elections have gotten closer in America. We're a divided nation, blue states versus red states. The 2000 election just showed how close the contest can be. That recount in Florida, which I think had more incompetence and administrative oversight to it than perhaps overt fraud, nonetheless showed just how divided we can become and how big the stakes are, because we still live with many of the scars of that election and the subsequent recount. We don't want to go through such a situation again. The way to prevent another Florida-style recount meltdown is to take steps today that will increase confidence of every American in the integrity of our elections and the accuracy of the vote count. If we don't do that, I suspect we're heading for a very close election again in 2012, and all of the polls tell us that. We are going to see enough invective and enough vitriol and enough questioning of people's motives, even if we don't have any questions about the integrity of the election. Imagine how divided we will be. Imagine how much more difficult it will be for us to solve our fiscal problems, our debt problems, to come together in any kind of a consensus if we have another election in 2012 that resembles at all the kind of furious contest and bitter dispute that we had in Florida 2000. And the danger is even greater that we will have that in 2012, because in 2000, no one was expecting the election to be that close. There had not been the arms race of lawyers that we see today. In 2012, I guarantee you, there will be thousands of lawyers on both sides of the political spectrum waiting to enter a contest, challenge it, litigate it in court, and once again try to drag the results away from the ballot box voters and will take office with such legitimacy that they will be able to help solve our problems.
Thank you, John. Fund. I will turn it over to Catherine Engelbrecht.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom, for inviting me here. Thank you, Judicial Watch. Thanks to all of you for taking time out of the day. I can assure you that a couple years ago, I never in my wildest imagination I would be sitting on a panel like this having these discussions. But I would like to share with you the journey that brought me here and encourage at the end of it for all of you to find yourselves on a similar journey, because I think that nothing less than the stake of our republic is at hand if we don't evolve. That is to say that in 2008, I found myself sort of swept up into what we all now know lovingly as the Tea Party movement. For me, it was hearing Rick Santelli on the floor of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange just throw out to whomever was listening, and I happen to be one of the folks listening, you know, what are we doing here? I think it's about time that we as citizens get involved. And as you heard Tom say, I had no political background, so I thought, well, I'll just step into it. I'll just step into this. If Tea Party was to become something, I wanted to engage. And one thing led to the next, and I found myself going to rallies, and I'd never done anything like that before. I'd never bought poster board and glitter paint to make a sign for anything since I was in the 5th grade science project. It was such a new experience, but the bottom line is it was really just a transitory phase in coming to grips with the fact that we have voices as citizens, and that while I had always, for most of my adult life, thought that you hire the right people to put into office, you hire the right guy, and they go and they do their job, and citizenry largely ends when you cast your vote, I had no real understanding of the importance, and shame on me, but I had no real understanding of the importance of civic engagement. And so we started an organization called King Street, and we set about looking for things that we could do. Election integrity wasn't on my top 10 list of ways to be involved, but we wanted something. And this is now in 2009. We had been told that there was a need for people to go and work at the polls. And we thought, we can do that. That's simple enough. We'll go. And I had this vision of me being the person that hands out the little I voted sticker. That was going to be my big contribution for the day. And it really changed. It really changed my path personally because of what we saw on the day that about 20 of us at the time went and worked at the polls. Now, to place you, we are out of Houston, Texas. Houston, Texas is not known, Texas in general, not known as a hotbed of voter fraud. We certainly had no intent of going in and expecting that. We'd been trained by the county. We thought that it would just be standard operating procedure. And what we saw set us back on our heels, because we saw people who would come in and not show any form of identification whatsoever and be passed right through to the voting booth. Now in Texas, you do have, I know some states you don't, but in Texas, at the time, there are up to 11 different forms of ID that you can show. You can show your Blockbuster video card. That was sufficient, but you had to show something. And that was not even being exercised. More disturbing still, though, we saw people who would come in and say, I don't remember who to vote for. And then the election judge would escort them to the voting booth and cast their vote for them. Now, what I'm speaking to, please hear me clearly. I am in no way asserting that there should not be assistance when assistance is needed, okay? There are people who have language barriers, they need assistance. People who have physical limitations, they need assistance. People who don't understand how to operate the equipment or just the process, that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is people who literally didn't know who to vote for went to the voting booth, and you would hear comments like, this is how you vote, straight party, or in 2010, we had 90 people on our ballot. And you would hear them say, 90 people, that's an awful lot. Just, I know you want to skip to the end. Just here's how you vote. Just vote these top two here. Click 2 to the left, 3 to the right, punch, you're done. And effectively what was happening is that person was having their vote stolen right out from underneath them. Ladies and gentlemen, when you see something like that, if you go home and pretend that it hadn't happened, you are nothing more than an accomplice to the crime. And we couldn't. So we decided that we'd get involved and we'd see, I mean, what was the depth of the problem that we faced in our community? What was the depth of the problem possibly across the nation? We had no idea. What we knew were that we knew two things, essentially. We knew what we'd seen, and we knew that there was a desperate need for people to work at the polls across the country. And so with that in mind, we decided to deconstruct the process soup to nuts. We began to look at how names and how registrations are added into our registry, looking at the accuracy of our registry in general, encouraging people to work at the polls, and then all along the way collecting data that would either bear out or support the need for election code reform, comprehensive reform in the legislature. At each step, not going in with any preconceived notion of what we might find, but rather as citizens saying, you know, it was always the intention for citizens to be involved. I think, you know, certainly, you know, John and Christian, and Hear What Happens at Judicial Watch, they represent the 30,000-foot view